Hello friends, as we continue our walk through 1 Timothy, we come today to 1 Timothy chapter 2, in which Paul begins by saying, I urge that all kinds of prayers should be made, for all people, for kings and those in authority, so that we may live a peaceful and quiet life in all godliness. This is good and pleases God our Saviour, who wants everyone to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. So this is what I think is happening structurally in this passage. We begin with an umbrella exhortation. I urge you to pray together with all kinds of prayers. Then he talks about for all people, and he returns to all people in verse 3, where he talks about why we should pray for all people. In between, he urges that we should pray for kings and those in authority, referring to civil rulers, so that we can live peaceful lives. In other words, there's a little bit of a chiastic flavor here. So he starts with all, then he has kings, then he gives the reason for praying for the kings, and then he comes back and gives the reason for praying for all. I think there are three reasons why Paul urges that these prayers need to be prioritized in the life of the church. Number one, they would allay suspicions and concerns that the Christian community was anti-Roman authority and rule. Because Christians, like Jews, were unable to practice any kind of emperor veneration, they were viewed with great suspicion in society. And one of the ways they could reduce that suspicion was to publicly, amongst other things, pray for God's favor and blessing on the emperor, on Caesar that is, and on the establishment and the rulers in place. So this was something of a pragmatic reason for praying. We probably don't, in most Western and free societies today, have a direct transfer for that rationale. But partly praying for kings and those in authority would help to ensure that the church enjoyed the favor and the peace to continue its ordinary practices. Secondly, the church was torn apart by conflict, and part of that conflict was over false teaching that seems to have indicated some focus on elitist knowledge. And what Paul does here, by emphasizing that God our Savior desires all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth, and urging the church in its totality to pray along those lines, he is reinforcing that the gospel is not for some elitist minority. Rather, the gospel is for everybody. And when the church comes together and prays along those lines, it will help to break down some of those elitist tendencies. And thirdly, the church was torn apart by conflict. It's very difficult to keep on fighting with people if you're praying with the people that you have differences with. And particularly, if the people of God could pray together for things that are outside of their petty squabbles, namely the global mission of God to reconcile all people to himself through Christ. This takes your eyes off of the petty things that you're squabbling about, the incidental, small, probably not that relevant things, and focuses the believer's gaze on the mission of God and on the missional God. And somehow that helps to combat the petty squabbles that would have separated them. So I think Paul's giving them three reasons to pray. Reasons that somehow say that when we focus on praying for God's global mission to reconcile all people to himself, it breaks down false doctrines, it breaks down petty squabbles, it even softens the hearts of those who may be suspicious of us as God's people. And it, in the process, establishes or reestablishes in our priority scheme as the church, the mission of God. And only good things can flow from putting the mission of God front and center in the life of a believing community. So Paul, when he wants to turn to Timothy about how do you start to address some of the challenges in this church, the very first thing he tells him, first of all, right at the start, he says, first of all, I urge that prayers, supplications, and petitions and thanksgivings be made. He's telling him, start by praying, and preferably praying as a community in a way that focuses your whole community on the missional priorities of God. And when we do that, I think it breaks down many of the things that serve to divide us. If that's helpful, please give this a thumbs up and consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next installment.